McConkey. I'm a caver who's been caving for pretty close to 50 years and have been caving at a cave called Grand Caverns in Virginia for at least 40 of that. I'm also the cave's de facto historian, also the historian for the town of Grottoes nearby, so I've done extensive research on the history of the caves. And I just want to give you an overview today.
Oh, sorry.
Of the caves and their importance to the area. So without further ado, let me share the program here. So the talk today is on the history of Grand Caverns and Cave Hill, which is the hill that contains Grand Caverns. Grand Caverns, which is formerly known as Weyers Cave, is not necessarily the most famous cave in Virginia, but it should be. It's the oldest continuously operating commercial cave in the country and easily one of the most spectacular on the East Coast. I personally think it is the most spectacular, but that might be up for a little bit of interpretation. Anyway, Cave Hill is located in Grottoes, Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley, 7 miles east of the town of Weyers Cave, around exit 256 off Interstate 81. It sits right on the south branch of the Shenandoah River. And just in case anybody's wondering, the town of Weyers Cave is named for the cave, but it's not where the cave is located. It's where you got off the train on the B&O Railroad in order to go to Weyers Cave. So they're 7 miles apart. You would have to take a taxi of the day over or walk. But the land has alternately been farmland, it's been mined, it's been various sorts of parks, a regional park, county park, and it now currently belongs to the city of Grottoes and is a town park. The cave itself, Grand Caverns, is open as a commercial tourist cave. You can go there and take tours, which I absolutely recommend. It's as I said, the most spectacular cave on the East Coast. So the area itself is of great importance, particularly in the early settlement of the Shenandoah Valley. So even though the coastal regions of Virginia had been settled since the very early 1600s, the Shenandoah Valley itself wasn't settled for at least 100 years or more after that. And the settlers did not come from the coastal parts of Virginia over the Blue Ridge to get to the Shenandoah. They came from the north, dominated by Germans and Irish from Pennsylvania area, coming straight down the valley into Virginia. And of course, there were several stopping points, but the farmland on this broad floodplain of the Shenandoah River is just so rich. It's some of the most fertile soil in all of Virginia that it was just prime territory to set up farms. You also had the South River right there, which gave an abundant source of water power for mills and anything else you might need it for. It was actually used for transportation at one point to take goods from Grottoes and the neighboring town of Port Republic and ship them upriver, or actually downriver, to Harper's Ferry, where they could be loaded on boats and sent down the Potomac. So there were 3 commercial caves found in this hill at various points over the years, or 3 caves that were commercial at some point, and they brought enormous amounts of tourism and fame to the area, which of course supported local hotels and people to sell them food and such. The area is also important for minerals. So ochre, which is used for pigments like for making paints, saltpetre, which is used for making gunpowder, and iron were all mined in this immediate vicinity. It was also a very strategic location because Grottoes sits right next to Brown's Gap in the Blue Ridge, which is the easiest way to cross the Blue Ridge coming from Charlottesville and then further on to Richmond. So when the town of Grottoes first formed in the late 1800s, there had been earlier incarnations, but the actual town formed about 1888. There was the B&O Railway came north-south through the town of Weyers Cave. The N&W Railway came north-south through the town of Grottoes itself. And with Brown's Gap being right there, the plan was to run another train line from Richmond through Charlottesville, over Brown's Gap, through Grottoes, and then out to the coal fields of West Virginia. And that would have made this a very, very important junction in the whole valley. It's also important historically because of 2 Civil War battles that were fought here. So over the 200 years that the cave has been known and visited, plenty of people have written up reports and published articles about their visit to the cave. And that's really helped historians like myself and also scientists who've been trying to study caves, because it gives us a lot more data than we ever had. So along with these descriptions, of course, they would talk about their trials and tribulations and how they had to crawl or go through mud or whatever. But back in the early 1800s was really the age of scientific discovery. Really, thermometers had just been invented, and they were the latest thing for the well-off to have. So if you were rich and famous and important, you had a pocket thermometer and you had a pocket chronograph so that you could keep track of time and temperature. And so over the 200 years of cave, I've probably got 100 different data points where some visitor has said, and I whipped out my pocket thermometer and it read 56 degrees on the scale of Fahrenheit. Or it might be on the scale of Ramo, and then I would have to translate it. But we have 200 years of data where you don't have that kind of data on any other cave anywhere. A lot of the tourists also made incidental mention of biology, in particular bats. There's one description from the early 1800s which mentions a dense cluster of bats in one point in the cave. And these days we know that could only be Virginia long-eared bats, which have not been known to inhabit the cave for as long as we can remember. So knowing that they were in the cave at one point, we have to wonder what's happened or what was different back then, that the cave was a good environment for them then, but not now. And of course, there's been more modern science. There's magnetic geology studies where the poles of the Earth switch about every 10,000 years. So you can track the magnetism changes in the calcifications in a cave and sort of determine time lengths that way. There's also ongoing water percolation experiments to try to see how long does it take the water to come down from the surface to get into the cave. So there's been 200 years of science, and we're still exploring it for its everything that's available. Of the geology of Cave Hill, I'm not going to say a whole lot. Hopefully, Dan Doctor has covered most of that this morning. This presentation is pre-recorded, so I don't entirely know. But like most caves, this is formed in limestone and dolomite, which is a close relative of limestone, which is laid down in horizontal layers across the broad floodplain of the valley. The limestone is topped with a couple thin layers of shale and sandstone, which are less permeable to water. So as water percolates down from the surface, it'll hit especially the shale and go sideways because it can't go through the shale. And so it limits the development of caves below. But one of the unique things about this hill is the orientation of the limestone. So you can see this dashed black line cutting diagonally through the hill here. That's a kind of geologic fault. So everything north of that fault, the limestone bedding that had been horizontal at some point has been thrust by magnificent forces and bent so that it curves up and it's completely vertical north of the hill or north of the fault. South of the fault, the bedding sort of returns closer to horizontal, though it never quite gets there. But as a result of the vertical bedding, the water has an easier chance to flow in the layers between the limestone and the shale, in the layers that it would not normally be able to pass through. And so we essentially can build up 150 feet of water pressure for the formations being formed in the cave. And we think that has a lot to do with some of the unique formations that are found in this cave, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the hill is basically hollow. There are 23 known caves. There's certainly areas where there is more cave that is known, but we just can't get into. And you can see on the map here, all these green circles are sinkholes, and you'll notice they kind of follow the cave passage here, but keep going past the fault. I dug open a cave in this last sinkhole here many years ago that drops down about 150 feet. And the only person who's ever been to the bottom of it says they saw a bat fly into a crack at the bottom. So there's cave down there. We just can't get to it. And my guess is there's several more miles of cave on the south side of the fault. We just, maybe someday we'll figure out a way in. But moving on to the 3 commercial caves in the hillside, the very earliest mention of a cave in the area was when a piece of land was called Cave Bottom in a land deed in the 1740s. Joseph Hanna bought a piece of property right next to Cave Bottom and actually went into the cave and mined it for ochre, which was used as a pigment for paints. The cave was mined for saltpetre. Definitely in the 1700s, there are several mentions of that, probably for the Revolution, definitely for the War of 1812. But by 1812, the yield was really poor. So I don't think anybody really bothered for the mining for saltpetre during the Civil War. But there were saltpetre evaporation vats and other such things at the cave until probably 20 or 30 years ago. So the cave was originally called Hanna's Cave after Joseph Hanna and was later renamed probably by Thomas Jefferson for John Madison, who lived in Port Republic 2 miles up the road, who was the uncle of President Madison. So, but Thomas Jefferson visited the cave in 1787 and sort of gave it a huge boost of fame. So the French ambassador had asked all the states or all the colonies at the time to answer a set of queries about what kinds of, how many people do you have, how much square area, what are your major products, what do you export, what do you import, and that sort of thing. So Jefferson was drafted to write Virginia's response. And although this was a diplomatic document presented to the French embassy, his friends thought it was so well written that they demanded he publish it. And it really almost overnight became the first international bestseller. It was published in Paris, London, Philadelphia, and it literally attracted tourists from all over the world. So it brought a huge amount of fame and recognition to the cave. While he was there in 1787, he drew the very first cave map that's known to have been drawn in the United States, which you see here. This is a so-called eye draft. He did not have a compass with him, so the passages are a little crooked, but it's not too bad. But as I said, they brought tourists from around the world. But the problem with it was Jefferson's description was so eloquent that pretty much every subsequent report from this cave can be paraphrased as, Mr. Jefferson did such a good job describing the cave, I'm not even going to bother. And so we get no more information for the next 200 years. But some of the other early famous visitors, probably hearing about it from Jefferson, a young Meriwether Lewis visited the cave with an uncle, I believe, Robert Grattan, and they put a boat in the back of the lakes at the back of Madison's Cave and tried to explore tried to figure out the depths and lengths, and they never really discovered very much. But on the Lewis and Clark expedition, in their diary, they got out to Oregon and they actually mention having been at Madison's Cave. So the cave saw a few years of visitation based on Jefferson's reports, but shortly after Grand Caverns was discovered and people stopped going to Madison's. The cave was later reopened about the turn of the century to 1800s to 1900s. Very briefly, there were some electric wires installed, but I don't think the cave was ever really commercialized. Another famous visitor was George Washington, who we fondly call America's first cave vandal, because he wrote his name on every cave he ever visited, and I think he visited just about every cave that was known in Virginia at the time. So back in the day, it was common and even encouraged for people to write their names in caves to show that they had been there. Although these days that's considered defacing the cave and it's highly frowned upon and is actually illegal in most places. Cavers will actually go and remove signatures they find in caves unless they're very old, in which case we keep them for historical significance. In this case, George's signature is a foot high and 6 feet long. We can't mess with that. But a few years later, the second cave on the hill became known. So on land owned by Matthias Amann, who was a very big farmer in the area, he owned the local grist mill and sawmill and whiskey distillery and several other establishments. He was sort of the economic engine of the area at the time. And the superintendent of his whiskey distillery, a guy named Bernard Weyer, was out trapping one day on Amann's land, noticed one of his traps missing and went to find where it was, and traced it to a hole in the ground. So he moved a few rocks and ended up entering what's now Grand Caverns. So at first Amann tried to name the cave after himself, of course, but then the public would have no part of it. They say Weyer discovered it, we're going to call it Weyers Cave. And so the name quickly switched. So most descriptions say that the cave was discovered in 1804, but I've found no solid evidence of that. The first signatures in the cave are from February of 1806. I think that's probably actually when the cave was discovered. And I have a feeling some of the confusion comes because Bernard Weyer signed an 1804 signature in Madisons Cave, but not in Grand itself. So the cave opened to the public shortly thereafter. The owner installed a wooden door with a lock so he could charge admission. I think they charged 50 cents for the original tours, which was a small fortune back in those days. But visitation started almost immediately, and the cave was so much bigger and so much more extensive than Madison's that people just stopped going to Madison's. The cave was extremely popular on the 1800s tourist circuit, so people wanting to escape the sweltering heat in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore and Richmond would all take a summer-long tour of the Shenandoah Valley, and they would visit all the sites. They'd visit Weyers Cave, they would visit the Natural Bridge, they'd go to the hot springs and take the waters, and they just make a whole summer out of it. And so even in more recent times, National Geographic has called it the #2 cave in the country, and I don't think they're far off. So this is the very first known map of Weyers Cave, or in this case, it was still being called Amann's Cave, here shown with Madison's Cave on the left. The map was drawn in 1806 by Jacob Peck of Stanton for Dr. William Boys, who lived in Stanton. And Boys had a mutual friend with Thomas Jefferson and sent Jefferson this map. Jefferson then included this map along with his own sketch in the 1853 edition of his Notes on the State of Virginia. So that book was so popular, even 60 years after it was first published, it's still being published. I believe it's still being published to this day. But on that map, one of the rooms was labeled the ballroom. All the rooms were named after rooms of a typical house, a sitting room, the kitchen, whatever, but there was a ballroom. And in fact, they held balls in the cave. So in 1806, one of the rooms was called the ballroom, and as early as 1810, there was a documented dance in that ballroom. So where you wouldn't normally think about having a dance in the cave, but where else could you dance the night away without sweltering in the summer heat? It's 54 degrees underground. It's perfectly pleasant for having a dance. So they would bring in bands, and all kinds of people would come in and have a giant dance. And the owners of the cave, of course, played this up and would advertise far and wide for what they would call their grand illumination and ball. And at the time when you went on a normal tourist trip, you would carry one candle apiece, and which is very dim light, but it was enough to get a feel of the cave. But for these grand illuminations, the owners would bring in upwards of 5,000 candles to light the cave for the ball. Typically 18-inch tapers, so long, tall candles that would burn all night. And so these dances persisted throughout the 1800s and were very popular. And even in modern days, we have since recreated some of these dances. Obviously, this photograph could not have been taken of one of the original dances. This was from a few years ago, mostly cavers in that picture. But the park, in conjunction with the park, we hold the grand illumination balls. The cavers come in and light up, not quite using 5,000 candles, but we do a pretty good job of it. And a wonderful time is had by all. If you ever get a chance, this is a completely unique event. Make sure to attend. In 1854, a man named David Strother, who was writing under the pen name of Porte Crayon, visited the cave, and he wrote a series of semi-fictional articles for Harper's Illustrated, which was kind of the National Geographic of his day. And so here on the left, you see one of Porte Crayon's original woodcuts of the cave from the 1850s, and then a modern photograph on the right. And again, here's another one of his woodcuts versus the modern picture. So his tales were basically of him and his 3 female cousins who were bored one summer, and they begged their famous Uncle Porte, the famous adventurer, to take them on an adventure somewhere. So they made a loop through the whole Shenandoah Valley, visiting all the major sites. I'm sure part of it was based on reality, because Strother actually came to the cave and spent several days there, but without his cousins. But this series was immensely popular. Now, in another part of Grand, you find formations that it's particularly known for, called shields. So they're sort of discs of stalagmitic material. So whereas a normal stalactite forms by water droplets leaving a thin ring of mineral deposition, and then which grows into a long, thin tube and eventually builds up around it. A shield is basically a 2-dimensional version of the same thing. It's essentially 2 thin pancakes stuck together with water circulating around in between. Nobody really knows how shields are formed, but it's thought to require water under pressure shooting out of a slot in the rock to start one of these things. And of course, in a normal cave, when you have these permeable layers topped with impermeable layers so that you can't get a whole lot of water pressure building up, it's just not possible to form a shield. But in this case, with the bedding plane being completely vertical in Grand Caverns, we've got 150 feet of water pressure that can drive the formation of these things. You see, just in this picture alone, there's probably a dozen shields. Their shields are very rare. Most caves have none. If you find them at all, it's usually 1 or 2. There are 1 or 2 caves in the country that have a fair number of them, but not that many. The commercial section on Grand here has at least 250 shields of all sizes and shapes and orientations. And as I'll get to in just a short while, we discovered a new part of the cave that's got at least as many more. So there are probably over 500 shields in Grand Caverns altogether. Now, another reason the cave is historically important is because 2 major Civil War battles were fought in the area. So the first, in June of 1862, the Battle of Cross Keys and Port Republic ended Jackson's Valley campaign. So that was really fought 2 miles to the north of here. But immediately after the battle, Jackson brought his troops to the cave, to the flat plain just outside the cave, and rested for 6 days to recuperate from their battles and to celebrate their victories. And of course, during that time, a lot of the soldiers who were on sort of liberty at the time all went in the cave and toured. And then 2 years later, the tables were turned. The Union Army was camped kind of in the same place, with most of the Union officers in the cave one morning, when the Confederates found out they were there and attempted to launch a sneak attack. The attack didn't quite get there in time. The Union officers escaped. They could have easily all been captured at once if the Union had been a couple hours earlier. But the Union Army got away, although they had to beat a hasty retreat. And then the Confederate Army camped there that night. And of course, they all went into the cave and had tours. And so throughout the cave, we find there are thousands of signatures in the cave, and just hundreds and hundreds from Civil War soldiers, most of whom would not only give their name, but their unit numbers and when they were there. We've tried to document all these and photograph them, put them in a database. We're working on a database. It's slow going. But You see pictured here probably the most famous signature in the cave, which is very close to the entrance, of Captain William W. Miles of the 14th Pennsylvania Cavalry, clearly one of the Union officers who was in that morning. Probably not a foot and a half away from this signature is the signature of Confederate Captain Asa Rogers, who visited the cave on the same day, just a couple hours later. But throughout the cave, there are signatures of both sides, and an awful lot of history there. So besides signing their names, many Civil War soldiers also kept personal diaries and journaled about their exploits during the war. So this is just one example of this Confederate Private Henry Berkeley. He wrote in his diary about having visited the cave and how they just drove off the Yankee cavalry. He didn't get too far in the cave because they couldn't find very many candles to go in, but he was very delighted that they had captured a whole bunch of excellent beef from the Union encampment, and they had a really good dinner that night. So in 2003, fast approaching on 2006, which would have been the cave's bicentennial, so it would have been open 200 years then, the owners of the cave at the time, the Upper Valley Regional Park Authority, asked Virginia Region cavers to make a new map of the cave for the bicentennial. And we figured, how hard can this possibly be? The cave has been known for 200 years. It's been explored ad nauseum. There's nothing new to find. There was about 3,600 feet or about 3/4 of a mile of known mapped passage. So we figured this would take us, maybe a couple weekends to do. Well, one of our team members had just gotten a new dog and couldn't leave it at home yet. So she brought the dog to the cave with her. And the dog was in the cave with us, and a tourist group was coming by. So we all pulled off to the side. And while the cavers were all off at the side, the dog started sniffing in this obscure little crack off to the side. And we started, well, where does that go? I don't know. Nobody's ever been down there. So after the tour left, we sent some people down to check it out. They got down and they found a small little pool with a pickaxe in it. So somebody had clearly been down there, although quite a while ago. We have no idea. But pushing just beyond that pickaxe and small pool, they came to a wide but very low crawlway. So this crawlway is only 8 inches high, although it is nice and wide so you can spread out. At least if you fit. I don't fit, so I've only seen pictures. But if this looks grim enough, it gets worse before it gets better. So there are some really body-sized places you have to squeeze through in order to get into the new section, or just to see what comes beyond. But the first explorers through there persevered through places just like this, and their diligence was aptly rewarded when they stood up and just looked up and like, where is the ceiling? Because they opened back up into passages the same size as the other passages in Grand, probably 60 or 80 feet high, with floor to ceiling formations everywhere. And they were just astounded at what they had found. This had never been entered before. Nobody even knew this existed. And so formations of every kind decorate just everywhere you look. Here's a beautiful crystal clear pool with crystals in the bottom of it, a small shield hanging over top of it. This is the condition of the formations we find in this new section, just absolute pristine white calcite. You just never see formations that are this clear and pristine. Cave visitation always impacts the cave, whether it be the soot from early torches or just fibers from the clothing of the tourists. They all act, and a formation like this would become gray over time, just from having tourists come near it, even if they don't touch it or anything. So we jokingly say that we're using this new part of the cave to grow replacements for the commercial tour. And just to answer the inevitable question, there are no plans to develop this new section commercially. There's already plenty of tourist trail, more than enough in the commercial side of the cave, and the expense and the damage it would cause to the cave to make this part accessible would certainly not be worth it. However, the man you see there, Dave Saki, is a wonderful videographer, and he's made an excellent video of the new section and what it's like to travel through it. That video is shown continuously at the cave, and I believe it's also available for purchase on DVD. But just to give you an idea of the cave, well, here's a caver going up a cable ladder about halfway up, 40 feet up, and just formations everywhere. You can see the immense scale of this cave. There is one room at the southeast corner of this cave that covers over 2 acres. I mean, just a massive, massive space with formations that just absolutely dwarf the cavers. So we have all the usual kinds of formations: stalagmites, stalactites, bacon, draperies, but with none of the usual discoloration and wear. And of course, no signatures on this part of the cave. The only, quote, signature we found is a couple claw marks from a long departed bear who obviously found some other way in at some long point in the past. And whatever nature creates, nature can destroy. Here's a really bizarre sculpted stalagmite that has been sort of repeatedly built up and chopped away by different amounts of water. But everywhere you look in the cave, just absolutely pristine and gorgeous formations, which is completely rare both for tourists and experienced cavers alike. So as I say, you can see this on video, but you can't see it in person, unfortunately. And so at the end of our 3 years, what had turned from basically 3 weekends into 3 years, was that we had mapped nearly 4 miles worth of cave, which is over quadruple the original size. The map on the right is the new 2006 map compared to the very first 1806 map there on the left. And in 2006 at a ceremony, we presented the park with a 6-foot high resolution print of the map that currently hangs in their education building. Right before you go into the cave, you'll see it. But moving on to other caves on the hill, the last commercial cave on the hill was Fountain Cave, or originally called Weasts Cave. In 1835, the owner, Edward Weast, discovered a new cave by noticing some steam rising from the ground, and he followed it and found coming out of a fissure on the side of the hill. And the next day, he raised a party and explored the cave and soon opened the cave to the public. It saw a lot of visitation for a couple of years, and then visitations pretty much dribbled off to nothing. And in part because that it lies halfway up the eastern flank of Cave Hill, which is pretty close to vertical, and just getting up there was a pain in the neck. There's no easy way to get up there. And I think that really curtailed the visitation. And only later was the cave renamed Cave of the Fountains for these pools of water. There's actually 3 of them. There's one behind that's at a lower level. You just can't see it. So this is the entrance we normally go in. Beautiful stone archway here, this is the only entrance we'd ever known, and it was the only entrance known to have ever existed until some of my historical research, when I found out this entrance was actually blasted after the Civil War. The owner at the time was a Civil War veteran who had been a veterinarian taking care of horses in the war. But after the war, he decided he would reopen the cave, open his own cave hotel, and compete with Weyers Cave for visitors by staging his own grand illuminations, for which he would get special railway tickets. He would invite singing groups from as far away as Norfolk and Baltimore to come and perform in the cave, and they would have all the same sort of spectacular things as happened in Grand. But as I said, we'd always thought this was the original entrance to the cave, until some years ago I found an obscure booklet that was written about the cave the year it was discovered in 1835, of which there's only still 2 copies in existence. And it led me to realize that a cave I had previously mapped that's known as TI-59 Cave named after a calculator, was actually the original entrance to Fountain Cave. The physical connection to go from this cave into Fountain has long since been blocked to the point you can't physically go through it anymore. But I was able to make a voice connection with people inside Fountain and me being up in TI 59 to confirm the theory. So this is the original entrance that you see right there in the middle. And then only later, after the Civil War, did they blast the new entrance, which was closer to the top of the hill, much easier to access, and therefore visitation really started up again and was sort of in high gear for the next 100 years. And just like Grand, the formations are pretty much floor to ceiling, although the bedding plane in Fountain Cave is south of that fault line, so the bedding plane is closer to horizontal. The cave was fitted with stone staircases, sort of crude ones, but never with any artificial lighting. So all the tours were by candlelight back in the day. The only artificial lighting that I'm really aware of was some of the very earliest stereo photography that was done in the late 1800s was done in this cave by the use of magnesium flares. So the magnesium would be shot off. It would make a brilliant light to take a picture by, and then you had to wait 3 hours till the smoke cleared till you could try again. So as I said, the bedding here is much closer to horizontal. If you look at the top left there, you can see about a 20-foot thick slab of limestone. It's kind of going down as a staircase. And you think, oh, that's cool, until you realize that the slab here in the lower right that the photographer's standing on used to be on the ceiling. So at some point, that whole piece just detached and fell 20, 30 feet and landed intact. Must have made quite a rumble when it happened. But our survey was more than just the surveying of the caves themselves. So those were the 3 commercial caves, but the whole hill is basically hollow. There were, at least at the time from about the 1980s, there were 13 known caves on the hill. So we had to go find some of them because the park only knew about 6 or 7 of them. We had to find the rest. We found a dozen new caves in the process. We mapped sinkholes to see where cave passages might be and what is the relation of the sinkholes to the formations underneath. And in fact, pretty much under every one of these green circles you see over here is an area of intense formation development in the cave. So some of the other caves were relatively small, like this one called Fake Snake Cave. This cave is actually unusual because it's in sandstone, not limestone. I think there's 1 or 2 other sandstone caves on the hill, but they're pretty rare. So some of them really didn't go, but then some of them did. So this is a cave I discovered in 2004 on a solo winter hike, had to wait a month to come back. We only got 3 survey trips in it before we had to stop. We found out it's actually not in the park. It's just off the park property. The landowner at the time was somewhat hostile and asked us not to come back, so we haven't been back since. But we got about 1,000 feet of survey with plenty more to go. Ceiling heights can be 40, 50 feet in some places. And there's some places south of the fault where there's sinkholes where there's no known cave passage. I've opened up a cave in one of those. It's very likely there are several more miles of cave beyond the fault that we just can't get to. But our survey hasn't just been a survey. There's so much more that we've done there. Starting back, probably 1983 was kind of the start of it. There was a conservation project called Concave 1, which started a partnership that's lasted for at least 4 decades between the Virginia region cavers and the park, whoever happens to own it at the time. So there was this massive cave conservation effort in 1983, the focus of which was to fix broken formations in Fountain. They fixed a lot of big formations, but here's sort of the basic process on a smaller formation. So you have to play like giant jigsaw puzzle, find pieces that fit, pieces that go together, reattach them with cement or glue, and then put them back in place if you can figure out where they go. So over the last 4 decades, we've reassembled and rejoined over 400 formations in Fountain Cave. And one of the formations in this wall actually consists of 5 different pieces that were found, rejoined, and hung back in place. But 400 formations over 40 years is an awful lot of work. We also do a lot of maintenance projects around the park, things that the park doesn't have the resources to do. We've been tasked with things like vandalism cleanup. In this case, some vandals had thrown one of the park benches over the hill, and we had the ropes and rigging to get it back up. We do nature trail maintenance, beautification projects, flood damage projects. In 2004, a giant boulder fell down and took out the handrail on this used to be the main entrance to the cave. And after this, it was clearly determined that it was going to be just too dangerous for visitors to go up this way. So cavers came in, blew up the rock, got it out of the way, and then we begged, borrowed, and hopefully not stole as much steel as we could find, and we built them this whole new steel staircase on the safe side of the building so that the tourists had a good way in. Along the lines with our other conservation efforts, we were alerted to this trash-filled sinkhole near Madisons Cave. Now, anytime you have a sinkhole, it's a depression in the ground that feeds water directly down into the caves underneath. And so if you look here, we've got barrels that contained who knows what sort of toxic substances. We have old refrigerators and other machinery in there leaking who knows what. And all of this going down to a cave with endangered creatures in it. So we organized a cleanup, and with the great assistance of the town of Grottoes, who brought in dump trucks, we took out all this material out of the sinkhole, we sorted it, all the metal was sent off for recycling, and everything was disposed of in the best possible manner. And so there's no more dangerous substances leaching into the cave anymore. So I hope that gives you a good idea of the history of Cave Hill. It's got a very long history, well worth preserving. The main point here is the cavers have established and maintained a great relationship with the park over generations and generations of not only management changes, but ownership changes. We're one of the few constant things in the cave's life. The ownership seems to come and go every few years, although hopefully Grottoes will keep it now for a while. But we've gone through many, many changes and tried to be there for the cave to protect it, preserve it. And all along the time, we're keeping our activities in line with the goals of the NSS, which are scientific study, exploration, and conservation. And all these efforts continue to this day. Our conservation trips obviously have been called off this year and last because of COVID, but hopefully next year we'll be back in full swing and continue for many generations to come. So I hope you have enjoyed this talk and enjoy the rest of the talks with the symposium today. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. And now Jim McConkey is available for questions and answers or questions. Were there any questions in the chat?
Not yet.
Okay. Oh, because you could be.
Hi, Jim. That was a really excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
I share your enthusiasm for Grand as a stellar cave on the East Coast for sure. One of my favorites too. You know, I have a question about whether or not you know when the modern lighting system was installed in the cave, and if there's any documentation about that.
Yes, there is. So the very first lighting in the cave, if I'm not mistaken, was put in about 1880. It was one of the first electrically lit caves on the East Coast. And one of the mills that was about a half a mile down, downstream, I guess, from the cave, it was a grist mill. So it would grind normally wheat. but they somehow got a Westinghouse generator, which was like, I believe 600 watts for the whole cave. And they installed this generator down at the mill, and they set up a signaling system. So whenever tourists would come, they'd ring a bell or make some sort of noise. The millers would then go down to the mill, take the belts that are currently running the grist mill, switch them over to the electric generator, power the lights in the cave while the tourists were there, and then they would go back to milling grain afterwards. So
Wow.
I've actually got some documentation that it was a Westinghouse generator and they installed it at this mill. I'm not sure it was the first cave in Virginia. Luray had electric lighting just about the same time, early 1880s. But it's interesting to point out that this was only about maybe 5 years after the electric generator had really been developed and was available commercially. So generators were brand new at the time. So this was cutting edge technology. And I mean, if you think about it, 600 watts, that would run like 2 light bulbs. You know, it wasn't a whole lot of light for the cave, but it was certainly better than 1 candle per visitor.
Wow, that's fascinating. Do you know how often those cables may have been replaced, or when the last time they were replaced?
No, I don't. I know some of the cable has been replaced, you know, relatively recently, because we've been involved in some of the rerouting of cables where they've just deteriorated. And certainly a lot of the old cables, back in the day, it was common to use lead sheathing on cables to keep mice and other things from eating it. But of course, that's not particularly good for the cave. So in many old commercial caves, we find this lead sheathed wire, and we try to remove that wherever we can and replace it. So the cables have been sort of continually replaced for years, but some of the actual transformers and other electrical components in the cave have calcite incrustations on them from, you know, having sat in the cave for so long. Also made for a really interesting time surveying the cave, because these large transformers, of course, put off magnetism. So whenever they're on, they greatly affect our compasses. I was involved in surveying one small room off the ballroom where you saw the dance in the presentation. And there's a giant transformer back there. So whenever the tour would come on, they'd turn on the transformer and our compasses would literally move by 20 degrees. The only way we could survey it was to do a back sight from 100 feet away across the room, you know, through and past the transformer. We couldn't be anywhere near the transformer.
Thank you.
Sure.
Jim, there's a question in the chat.
Yep.
Regarding sinkhole cleanup. How were you able to identify what toxins were in the barrels, and how were you able to recycle or destroy them?
We did not actually identify the toxins in the barrels. The barrels were empty at the time and just, you know, essentially just rusty metal. We have no idea what might have leaked out of them at some previous time. It was, my guess, it was probably industrial oil, but can't really tell.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much, Jim. And I know you've got to get on the road, and I loved your presentation.
Thank you.
So, of course, I'm partial to that cave too, so I love it.